She didn't suddenly become cold. You just started noticing the distance before you understood what created it. At first, everything felt effortless. Conversations flowed naturally, almost without effort. Her energy felt warm, open, and consistent. There was a sense of comfort in how she responded to you, as if nothing needed to be forced or overthought. Then something shifted, not in a loud or dramatic way, not in a moment you could clearly point to, but in a quiet, subtle transition that slowly changed the tone of the connection. Her replies became shorter. Her emotional openness reduced. The warmth that once felt automatic now felt slightly controlled. And that's where confusion begins. Most men misread this stage completely, because on the surface, it looks like disinterest. It feels like withdrawal. It creates the impression that something has been lost, but what you're actually seeing is only behavior, not the reason behind it. You're reacting to what changed externally, without understanding what is happening internally. And when you miss that distinction, you start assuming the worst, when in reality, the situation is far more complex than it appears. The connection didn't break. It evolved in a way you didn't immediately recognize. At the beginning, everything feels light and natural. There is no pressure to define anything, no fear of emotional risk. She responds freely, expresses herself openly, and engages without overthinking. In that stage, attraction is simple. It moves without resistance. But as emotional awareness begins to grow, something changes internally. She starts to feel that the connection is no longer just casual, and the moment that realization appears, her behavior begins to adjust, not because interest is fading, but because emotional involvement introduces weight. She becomes more measured, more aware of how she responds, less impulsive in how she expresses herself. From your perspective, this can feel like distance, but internally, it is processing, not rejection. Most men assume consistency should look the same at every stage of attraction, but emotional dynamics don't stay static. They shift as depth increases. And with depth comes caution, not because she wants to leave the connection, but because she is beginning to understand what the connection is becoming and what it could mean emotionally if it continues to grow. What looks like emotional distance is often something far more subtle than disinterest. When a woman begins to feel something deeper than surface-level attraction, her behavior doesn't always become warmer or more expressive. In many cases, it becomes more controlled, more intentional, more measured, and from the outside, that shift can easily be misunderstood. Shorter replies, slower responses, and reduced emotional openness can feel like withdrawal. But internally, this is not always about pulling away from you. It can be about managing what she is starting to feel. Because deeper attraction introduces emotional vulnerability, and vulnerability naturally triggers caution. So instead of expressing everything freely, she begins to regulate her responses. She filters her communication. She controls how much she reveals at once, not as a game, not as a strategy, but as a form of emotional balance. This is where most men misread the situation completely. They assume that less expression means less interest. But in emotional psychology, the opposite can sometimes be true. Distance is not always rejection. Sometimes it is the mind and heart trying to process intensity before it becomes visible on the surface. When emotional attraction begins to deepen, it doesn't always express itself in a straightforward way. Instead, it becomes more complex internally before it becomes visible externally. A woman may start questioning her own feelings without openly showing it, not because she is unsure about you, but because she is becoming aware of what she is feeling and what it could lead to. Is this real or temporary? Is this safe or unpredictable? Am I moving too fast emotionally? These thoughts don't weaken attraction, they regulate it. This internal evaluation naturally slows down her outward expression. She becomes more careful with her words, more selective with her attention, and more intentional with her responses. From your perspective, this shift can feel like distance or emotional cooling, but internally, it is not disinterest, it is self-regulation. She is not disconnecting from you, she is trying to stay emotionally balanced within herself. And this is where most misunderstandings begin. When men interpret emotional processing as rejection, because in reality, she is not stepping away from the connection. She is stepping back just enough to understand her own emotions before allowing them to grow further. Even when her behavior becomes more reserved, it doesn't mean her attention disappears. In fact, in many cases, she becomes more observant than before. She may not express herself as openly, but she is still paying attention to how you move, how you respond, and how consistent you are. Her silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is observation, because emotional attachment doesn't only show through communication, it also shows through awareness. She notices details she didn't pay attention to before: your tone, your timing, your emotional stability, the way you handle distance, the way you respond without pressure, and even if she is less expressive, she is still present in the connection in a more controlled way. This is where many men misinterpret the situation. They assume that reduced expression means reduced interest, but presence does not always equal communication. When someone is truly disinterested, they disconnect fully. They do not stay engaged in any form. But when someone is regulating emotions, they often remain quietly involved, watching, processing, and adjusting internally. So what feels like distance may actually be attention in a more restrained form. One of the clearest signs that confuses most men is the change in communication style. Her replies become shorter, less detailed, less emotionally expressive, and naturally, it creates the feeling that something is fading. But short replies do not always mean emotional disinterest. In many cases, they reflect emotional control rather than emotional absence. When attraction is light, communication flows without effort. She responds quickly, adds detail, and keeps the conversation alive naturally. But when emotional depth increases, she becomes more intentional with how she communicates. She starts filtering her words. She avoids oversharing. She limits emotional exposure without fully disconnecting. From the outside, this looks like distance. But internally, it is regulation. She is still present, still responding, still engaging, just in a more controlled and balanced way. This is not about playing games or creating confusion. It is about maintaining emotional stability while processing deeper feelings. And that is why the connection doesn't fully break, because even in her reduced expression, there is still participation, still awareness, still presence. And presence, even in a quieter form, is never the same as absence. What many men label as mixed signals is often a structured emotional process they don't yet understand. It looks inconsistent on the surface. Moments of distance followed by moments of engagement. Less communication followed by sudden warmth. Controlled behavior followed by brief emotional openness. But none of this is random. It is regulation. When emotional attraction becomes stronger than expected, a natural internal balancing act begins. She doesn't want to lose the connection, but she also doesn't want to lose control of her own emotions. So she adjusts. She steps back slightly to regain emotional clarity, then re-engages just enough to maintain the connection. She reduces expression, then briefly allows it to surface before pulling it back again. From your perspective, this feels confusing, but internally, it is structured emotional pacing. She is not deciding whether she cares or not in every moment. She is deciding how much she is willing to show at each stage. And that is why focusing on individual actions leads to misunderstanding, because the truth is not in a single message, a delay, or a tone shift. The truth is in the pattern those behaviors create over time. When emotional attraction starts to deepen, the connection often enters a push and pull phase that confuses most men. On the surface, it may look like inconsistency. One moment she feels close, the next she becomes distant. At times she is responsive and engaged, and at other times she seems reserved and harder to read. But this is not emotional confusion. It is emotional management. She is trying to balance what she feels internally with what she is ready to express externally. The attraction is there, but so is the awareness of vulnerability that comes with it. So instead of fully leaning in, she regulates the intensity. She moves closer, then slightly steps back, not to disconnect, but to maintain emotional stability. Even in moments of distance, she does not fully disengage. She still responds. She still observes. she still remains connected in a controlled way. And in moments where her guard drops, even briefly, you may notice subtle warmth, a softer tone, a more natural reaction, a glimpse of emotion she quickly pulls back. That contrast is what creates the push and pull effect, and importantly, this pattern does not exist in absence of interest. It exists only where emotional involvement is present but still being processed. Even when she seems distant, she rarely becomes completely absent. Instead, she maintains a form of controlled presence. She is still there, still aware, still connected to the interaction, but in a more restrained and selective way. She may not initiate conversations as often, but she continues to respond. She may not express emotions openly, but she remains attentive to what is happening between you. This kind of behavior is often misunderstood because it does not match the expectations of clear, consistent communication. But emotional interest is not always expressed through intensity. Sometimes it is expressed through restraint. She observes your behavior more carefully during this phase. She notices how you react to distance. She pays attention to your emotional consistency, not just your words. And even when she reduces outward expression, she does not fully disengage from the connection. That alone is significant. Because when someone is truly uninterested, their presence disappears completely. There is no monitoring, no subtle engagement, no continued awareness. But when someone is regulating emotions, they remain partially involved. Quietly present, carefully engaged, watching without overexposing themselves emotionally, and that controlled presence often reveals more than open expression ever could. At certain points, the dynamic may feel like she is testing your response, not through direct confrontation, but through subtle behavioral shifts. She may slightly reduce her communication, change her tone, or become less emotionally expressive for a short period, and then she observes what happens next. This is not manipulation, it is observation. She is trying to understand emotional safety within the connection. She wants to see whether consistency remains, whether pressure increases, or whether calm stability continues. Because emotional attraction is not only about feeling, it is also about safety. If your reaction becomes intense, anxious, or overly corrective, the emotional space tightens. But if your response remains steady and grounded, the environment feels more stable, and stability matters more than intensity in long-term emotional connection. From your perspective, these shifts can feel confusing or unpredictable. But from her perspective, they are part of understanding how emotionally safe the connection feels. She is not testing to create distance. She is testing to understand depth. And how you respond in these moments often shapes whether she feels comfortable opening up further or whether she retreats back into control. The biggest shift most men fail to make in this situation is learning how to remain emotionally stable when the dynamic changes. When her communication becomes lighter, slower, or more controlled, the instinct is usually to react, to seek clarity, to increase effort, or to restore what once felt effortless. But that reaction often creates the opposite effect, because what she is actually trying to maintain in this phase is emotional balance. And when pressure enters the space, even unintentionally, it disrupts that balance. Emotional stability on your side changes everything. It means you don't overreact to distance. You don't chase immediate answers. You don't assume the worst from temporary shifts in behavior. Instead, you stay grounded and consistent, and that creates a different emotional environment. One where she doesn't feel forced to manage everything at once. One where she can process feelings without external pressure shaping her response. In that space, something important happens. Her nervousness reduces, not because the situation is solved, but because it feels safer to experience it naturally. And safety, more than anything else, is what allows emotional attraction to deepen without resistance or fear. Hot and cold behavior is often misunderstood as emotional confusion or inconsistency, but in reality, it is usually a reflection of emotional pacing. When feelings begin to grow stronger than expected, they don't always move in a straight line. Instead, they fluctuate as the mind tries to keep up with what the heart is experiencing. At one moment, she may feel closer and more expressive. At another, she may pull back slightly and become more reserved. This shift is not random. It is regulated. She is adjusting the intensity of her emotional expression to maintain internal balance. From your perspective, this can feel unpredictable, but internally, it is a way of preventing emotional overload. She is not unsure about the connection itself. She is managing how fast she allows herself to move within it. And that is an important distinction. Because when you misinterpret pacing as rejection, you start reacting to something that was never meant to be a problem. The connection is not breaking in these moments. It is simply slowing down internally before continuing to develop externally. And what feels like distance is often just emotional regulation, trying to stabilize what is becoming real.